Before we get started with the episode today of 15 Minute Catch Up, I wanted to take a minute just to say thank you for over the past few months to listening to 15 Minute Catch Up. This has been a personal project of mine that I started last summer in the depths of COVID, feeling disconnected from people generally. And I've always wanted to kind of catch up, have an excuse to catch up with folks from Governor's School to see what they're up to now, what they're doing. And it's been a really interesting ride. I plan to continue this series. I don't know for how long, but today is the last episode of season 1, and I'm going to be starting the recording on season 2 very shortly. I'd be interested, especially to hear from you all, the listeners, who you want me to interview from Governor's School. There's a Facebook thread that's kind of started on this. I've gotten a lot of great suggestions already. There'll be a link in the show notes if you want to click through that and just add your thoughts or vote for other people that have already been mentioned as to who you want to hear, faculty and students from Governor's School. And now we'll get to the last episode of season 1. My guest today is Sam Pritchard, class of 1999. So get us caught up on whatever's happened to you since you graduated.
Yeah, it's been a journey. I went to College of William & Mary for undergrad and ended up majoring in music composition. I thought I was going to go into a direction of making music for TV shows and movies and got a degree in that area. And I think since that time, my faith became a bigger part of my life and actually decided to go in a direction of Christian ministry. And so I went to a school in South Carolina and then Southern California and at Fuller Seminary and graduated with a Master of Divinity and was planning to go overseas with that. But once we had kids, it was just not quite the right time to move overseas. And so came back east. While I was in seminary, I just, as a part-time gig, started teaching SAT classes as a side job, and then looked into what else might be available in the test prep world, and have had a career in that since that time. And lived in Southern California for about 4 years, then the Philly area for about 6 years, and then Asheville, North Carolina, where I recently moved from, for about 5 years. And so now back home, Chesterfield County since September. And I'm now a single dad with 3 kids, and we're getting settled and doing okay in 2020 overall.
Doing okay in 2020 is quite an accomplishment. What has changed the most for you in 2020?
I think a couple of things. I think the adjustment for my kids doing school from home. I've got 3 kids. I've got a 7th grader, a 5th grader, and a 2-year-old. And so for the older ones, doing school from home was an adjustment. They had done a year approximately of cyber school before, where it was set up as a cyber school. And so I think they've kind of drawn on that experience. But I think I didn't appreciate how much just school creates a family rhythm. And when that's not there, it's just, okay, wait, how long have you been on YouTube? And what are you watching here?
You talked about your faith kind of awakening inside of you and you finding some, deeper faith in college. You're the second alumni, or maybe actually the third alumni now, that I've heard kind of that time period in their life was formative in terms of like their deepening faith. Can you just talk about like what specific things you think triggered that, like any influences on you? How did you come into that deeper understanding of where your faith was?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was just seeing young men and how they went about their life and saying, man, that's the kind of man that I want to be. And kind of contrasting that with, at that time I was in a band that, and I had these dreams of, I'm going to be this famous musician. And if I can achieve that, then that will really be a life. And I think there was a point after my freshman year when our drummer was going to do a semester in Ireland. Man, how can you do that, man? And it just seemed like what I had kind of been really setting my sights on, and almost a source of meaning for me, just kind of poof, was gone. And I had a roommate that actually sent me a letter over the summer and was just talking about how his faith was deepening and he was doing things and he felt like he was making an impact on other people's lives and talking about his faith to them. And that was having a positive impact on them. And the contrast was just so stark to me of, I'm just trying to seek attention and accolades from music that isn't working. That's really not even going to happen. And this is a man who's really living in a purposeful way. And I think that's what I want to be. Like, to your point, I think it is a time where people are kind of deciding, who am I going to be? And I think once you get into your 30s or even 40s, I feel like there's almost a psychological aversion to suddenly change what's really, really important to you, because you would almost have to say, well, what I've been doing up to this point was not the right thing.
Yeah, it's a perfect segue into my next question, which is a very related question. I think that a lot of us have expectations in middle school, high school, certainly college, about what they want to be, who they are. At some point, something happens that challenges that, and a lot of people are forced to adapt. And there's a lot of pride up to that point in terms of like you kind of cementing this identity, and then you are forced to change. And I think that some people deal with that more gracefully than others. I've certainly had to change. And I remember when going through that time period when I thought I was going to be a software developer and that was my identity, and finding out I wasn't great at it, like, was really challenging for me personally. You've had a couple pivots like professionally in terms of your career. When you finally settled on test prep and coaching and that kind of thing, what was that process like for you? And was it hard? And how much did you fall into that versus lean into it?
Yeah, I guess it was, as you said, there were a couple of pivots. I think sometimes it helps to realize that you don't have to make a lifetime commitment to something. And I think even now, I think there's a desire that at some point could go back in the direction of ministry and something that's globally minded. And so I think, as you said, from the time that we're kids, there's kind of a pressure to figure out, what will you be when you grow up? Kind of this career day mentality of, I am this, I always will be this. And I think we don't have to box ourselves into that. The experience that my father had of working for one employer for 40 years is likely not what any of us are going to do. And so I think I would say letting go of the pressure of saying, I have to figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up, and say, okay, what's the right thing for right now? And maybe that'll be 2 years. I think it's okay to make a decision for what's the right thing for me now, for my family now, for where I'm living now, for what my goals are. And you can have an intention with an uncertain timeline to go in a different direction. And as much as we might anticipate it, no one's really going to say, hey, I thought you were this other thing, but now you're switching. You can't switch. You can't be something different than you were. You can. And I think that perspective can be freeing.
Absolutely. One other thing that might be part of your identity, are you still running at all?
I am a bit, yeah. Sometimes it's been about 3 times a week. I think I'm down to about once a week. But I did the 8K at the Richmond Marathon a couple of weeks ago. They set it up in a way that I thought was really cool, where it was basically just a 2-week-long race where they just kept the course set up. And whenever you cross the start, that's when you started. And whenever you cross the finish, that's when you finished. And so I think it was one of the last people to start and last people to finish when there was only about an hour and a half left before the course shut down. But I do find physically, mentally, it's such a good habit, and that I'm better off when it's a part of my life.
You told a really good story about how the 8K was being creative this year, I assume to keep people socially distanced but still have their event. What have you had to do to adapt your business and the coaching and test prep stuff that you're doing?
Yeah. So the work I'm doing now is less test prep specific with Varsity Tutors, but I think for the business that I'm in now, there's been a lot of pivot and a lot of experimentation. And so early on, back in March, when schools shut down, we put out something called Virtual School Day, where just put out some free content and said, hey, there's a lot of kids at home with nothing to do. Parents are trying to work. We probably could help if we just made some free content with the tutors that we have. And that's really taken off, and had hundreds of thousands of students that have taken advantage of that. I've observed there's been so much variety around what schools have tried to provide for kids. Some private schools where they're on the hook to provide something that feels like it's worth paying tuition for. There's obviously a strong motivation to create something that is engaging and exciting and educational, of course. Some public schools, I listen to phone calls where the parents are just saying, well, I don't know, we got the packets, they gave us these packets, and you just imagine they drove up to the school and got some big set of papers stapled and said, work on this, we'll see you in the fall, hopefully. And I think it's been good to see that we've been able to provide some more engaging, live educational experiences for some of these kids, with astronauts talking about their journeys in space and a variety of things.
Totally. I wanted to ask you about an article you wrote for LinkedIn. One of the topics that's come up amongst a lot of alumni is the idea of equity in the incoming classes today in Governor's School. I remember I was class of 97, and I felt like we had a pretty good mix, but like when I saw some of the stats about the current diversity mix of incoming classmates into the Governor's School, it definitely seems to have skewed. It doesn't feel as representative of Richmond kids in particular. And the article you wrote was basically, if I could paraphrase, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, instead of getting rid of any sort of incoming evaluation test to determine fit for a person into Governor's School, there are ways to tweak or redo the test, the admissions test, such that it is more equitable. Can you just talk a little bit about your most recent thinking about how to make it more equitable?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization of what I had written, that I think that the Governor School and Maggie Walker and similar schools I see as something that it's a different sort of education than students get in a public school or even a private school. And I think the question ideally is, who are the students that need that? Who are the students that will benefit from that? And so I think that testing and gathering all available information is a wise way to do it. Certainly there have been real differences in achievement on tests by different races, and I think we can't just ignore that. But there is work that's being done by testing organizations like the College Board and ACT to put these scores more in context and to say these can be useful tools in identifying students that are outperforming their peers. And if someone's outperforming their peers, even if the actual score that they're getting is different from what someone in a more advantaged school might get, that's still a useful means of identifying students that could benefit, could thrive at a school like Maggie Walker. And so I think there's been something of a bandwagon where the idea of, if these tests are viewed as means of oppression, let's just get rid of them. But I do think there is a risk of making the admission something of a reward or a lottery that we're wanting to just distribute equally. And if that is what it were, then yes, we should be distributing it equally. But when I started freshman year and Algebra 2 was kicking my butt, it didn't feel like a reward. It felt like, okay, this is a different kind of training. This is a different kind of education. And I think figuring out the students that can thrive in that environment and who can take that and use that to help to reach their potential, I think that's an important question. And I think it is a worthy goal to say, how can we make sure that we're not missing students that are missing, non-white, non-Asian students that would benefit from it. But I think that the primary solution is proposing eliminating all tests. I think that's the wrong way to go about it. And in fact, we actually are better positioned to find those students by seeing who's outperforming their peers on tests like that. I think that the other thing I would say is a lot of the criticism on many of the tests is based on previous versions that are not the case now, where these kinds of IQ test style really is not what these tests are now. And there's this famous example of a test that was based on an easel, and the fact that a student in an affluent school likely to have been in a preschool that had easels and had an art center and things, where students that are from a more disadvantaged background the idea of an easel may not have been part of their personal experience. We need to look at those. And if it is skewing toward a certain experience, then that's problematic. But most of the major testing organizations have heard those criticisms and have really made adjustments to where now they're testing how is a student able to do algebra? How is a student able to understand complex reading passages that they would be likely to encounter in college or beyond? And I think those are important skills. Reading and understanding what you're reading and being able to solve problems are important skills that, for whatever your background, it's a useful and largely objective measure to evaluate a student's ability.
How do you account for folks who might be able to afford to do test prep versus people who can't? I mean, is there ever a test that can take out the bias for people who know how to beat the test?
That's a great question. What I would say is we tend to look at testing and test prep as this unique situation where you can get better by practice. But the reality is, in all of life, preparation helps you perform better. If you're going to try out for an athletic team, maybe you have a personal trainer that's going to help you. And you say, well, that's not fair. And I think some people see test preparation and things like that as artificially boosting the score. And we say, well, not everyone who needs a personal trainer can afford it. And that's true. And I wish they could, but then we wouldn't say no one should ever have personal trainers. But I think accounting for how students are doing compared to their peers in their school and in their neighborhood is one of the best ways to account for those differences.
Now that you're older than you were in high school, looking back, is there any skill that you wish you had gotten in high school that you didn't?
I think the way that you land in your career, I think, is different than almost all of us expected. I did a mentorship with an orthopedic surgery practice, which was fascinating when I was a senior in school. But I think there probably is more in equipping kids to figure out how to navigate through choosing majors, choosing careers, et cetera. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think there are students and classmates that have gotten blindsided at certain points because they didn't get into a certain program, or they didn't get hired, or they had this idea of something that would be so cool to do, and then they found they actually hated the day-to-day work of it. And I think there's more work in that area that can be done to equip kids for their future.
Great. And that's all the questions I've got. My guest today was Sam Pritchard, class of 1999. Thank you so much for your time today, Sam.
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate it.